Good morning, everyone. I need to confirm something. Hey, everyone. My name is Megan Masterson. I am the founder of Ground Down Composting, which Mike and Terry both mentioned. A little bit of my background, I don't have a traditional horticulture or farmer background. I actually studied biomedical engineering, and I worked in the IT industry for 10 years. I am not native to Fort Wayne. I moved here about 5 years ago, and I got really passionate about sustainability. So I started composting on my own at my house. And once I started doing that, I realized that this could really be something that a lot of people could do on their own, and noticed that there was a little bit of a gap of some people not wanting to do it on their own, whether it was stinky or they just didn't want to spend the time. So I decided to start Ground Down, and we pick up food waste and aggregate all of it and turn it into compost. I'm also a yoga instructor. I really don't know why I put that on there. Felt like it would help. But if you have any Zen yoga questions, I also teach yoga. That is my email. And I do want to give a little plug. Mark Ringenberg, I think, is going to be joining throughout the presentation at some point. And he has been instrumental in helping me grow as my business continues to grow. And he is hopefully going to share some of his wisdom. He has been composting for like 20 years. He has a background in soil from Purdue. So just a little plug, if you hear Mark say something, he's amazing and he knows a lot of stuff. So compost, what is compost? Some of you might have had an inkling of what compost is as you came into the presentation, but if you didn't, that's totally cool. It's a high nutrient soil amendment. So we could call it soil, but it's really an amendment. And what it is the result of organic waste breaking down. And normally when you break it down, you want to have, we'll go through more of the detailed information of what specifically goes into it in a little bit, but the basics are air, water, nitrogen, and carbon. And what it's used for, we'll get into a little bit as well, but basic bare bones information, there's a picture there for you to see. It's some organic matter, food waste, and otherwise going in to make soil amendment. A little bit more background on to why I started Ground Down, the food waste problem. In 2017, that's the latest stats I could pull, there was 267.8 million tons of waste generated by the US, and 30.6 of that million tons was food waste. And that was what was pulled from the landfill information. There was some information as well that about 2 million tons of that was composted, but that's such a big opportunity for us, even as individuals, our households there, but and then encouraging our households compost, and then encouraging our restaurants to compost in the community, we'll start to cut some of that down. So it's really important that if you don't compost, you start thinking about it, hopefully after this presentation, but just a little background on the food waste problem.
So Megan, can you talk a little bit about why we don't want those things in the landfill?
Yes, so there's like an awesome picture I wish I had now. But essentially the landfill, if you're not familiar with how it's built, they put like a layering down on the landfill, like a big plastic liner, much thicker than regular plastic. But what you're doing is all of the food waste that's going into the landfill, it starts to get layered with other stuff that doesn't break down. So the food waste will eventually turn into like goop and leach out. We'll talk a little bit about anaerobic digestion later on in the presentation, but that goop will leach out, and if it's not properly maintained, it can leach then into the groundwater, which would contaminate the water that we're drinking, the water that we're using on our plants. And this kind of links back to why the soil water conservation is putting this on. If we maintain it with the proper ratios of composting, then we can prevent that from happening in the landfill. Thanks, Terry.
Yeah, and it's important to think too that like our landfill isn't a giant composter, that it has other ecological effects that are can be pretty damaging. So just keeping that in mind as well.
And one other thing too, that's a really good point, is that the landfill doesn't last forever. So eventually it reaches its capacity. And right now we've got one landfill that I know of that's Southwest. I have heard that there was another landfill kind of out east by New Haven at some point that I think is covered up now. But once our landfill down here is completely full, we would have to find the new location for a landfill. And it's not necessarily something that people look forward to, like, sure, put the landfill next to my house. So if we can keep stuff out of that, then we can preserve the life of the landfill for other materials and take that food waste and other organic materials and actually just turn them back into something that we can reuse.
Beautiful. Great. Yeah. And one way we can do that is with composting. So I have this short little video that I'd like for you guys to watch. This is a lovely human that gets incredibly excited about composting.
The more I live and experience life, the more I realise that the answer is in the compost. Woo, who are you kidding? What are you on? You're living underneath the mulch or something? No, it's true. Compost is the only activity where we can all participate and turn death into life. And what's life? Life is really health. And when we create compost, we actually feed the soil, which feeds the plants, which feeds us. Suddenly we engage in ecology, we engage in ecosystems, we engage in life as it is every day. We eat, we create scraps. Those scraps, by virtue of nature's process, need to be broken down to be put back into the soil. And when you look at this, this is a living, breathing, healthy, look at it. I can't say anything more about it other than what's in there is actually in here. We're one big composting system. We take our food, we break it down into the nutrients, which makes us alive. And the more alive we are, the more we can think and understand this wonderful planet that we live on. Do something, get composting.
All right, composting chat is done. Any questions?
That guy is so excited.
I love it. Oh my gosh.
It is so cool. The process of composting is so cool.
Yeah, it is so neat. So we've got some different kinds of composting or different kinds of compost that you can use. And we're going to talk about some of these, not talk about others. But so there's yard trimmings and leaves. So here in Fort Wayne, we've got some great resources with the city of Fort Wayne that takes the yard trimmings and leaves, and you can purchase those, or they compost them for us. Food waste, which is what a lot of what we're talking about, is one of the biggest motivators for myself and Megan for composting. There's also mushroom compost. So in Fort Wayne, we have Windrows Urban Farm that has the spent blocks that can be used as a compost, but that's also something you can find, that bags of mushroom compost at big box stores. There's worm castings. There's also something called soldier fly compost. That's essentially the poo of different animals and insects that we use as a compost. And then there's just straight up manure. So a lot of the common manures that we use are cow, horse, chicken, sheep, and then sometimes human manure as well. And with manure, we have to be very careful because it's going through the digestive tract of an animal, that a lot of diseases can be spread through that and different pathogens. So manure is one that we are particularly concerned with making sure that safety is a concern. So doing the composting and making sure to treat and do the proper things we need to do to reduce those risks that we have to our human health. And biosalads is another one. So biosalads is essentially another name for that human the human manure that we have. So it's a byproduct of our wastewater treatments, and here in Fort Wayne, it's a product that has tested heavily. They make sure that there's not a lot of heavy metals and different things. But if you use it over time, there is heavy metals in it, and it can be an issue for your soil. So making sure to keep that in mind. And then for a lot of these too, there's different pesticide residues that can live in these composting or this compost. And so just being clear as to what you're putting into it, because what you put into it is what you're going to be getting out of it as well. Megan, do you have anything you want to add about the different types of compost?
I think not really. The important thing here is that there's all of these different types, and then you can combine a lot of these different things together. So depending on how scientific you want to get with your mixtures, you can get really nerdy with this stuff. So you can take it really simple, or you can get really, really intense with it. There's a lot of options.
Yeah, and we're going to be covering some of the science behind it, but also keep in mind, Megan and I both like to keep things pretty simple too. Mm-hmm. So we hope to make it attainable for you guys.
So getting into, I saw someone popped up, Amy, with a question about, are we going to be covering backyard composting? Yes. So right now we want to go through, how do you make compost? What are the different components that you think of when you're making compost? So the first one is, if you're doing any research online, you might see the word feedstock, and that just means your input materials. So that's going to be like the yard waste, the manure, the food scraps. What are your input materials? The second thing that is really important is heat, oxygen, and then moisture. So we're going to talk about all of those different things. First thing for feed, oh, go ahead, Terrie, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so all of this, whether you are a backyard gardener or large production like Megan does on a larger scale, these are all important regardless. So we're just going to cover some of those basics.
So the most important thing when you're thinking about composting, again, in your backyard or on a larger scale even, is what are your input materials? And with that, it's all about the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So sometimes you might also hear this if you're doing some research as browns versus greens. So browns are going to be that carbon material, and greens are going to be more heavy nitrogen materials. So we did a couple of little options here to help you understand the difference. High carbon materials are generally brown in color and drier. An example of something that would be a carbon material is dried leaves. So saving all of your leaves at the end of the fall in little bags is awesome, and you can use them throughout the year in your compost. Other things are wood chips, and wood chips are a little bit interesting just because they're thicker, so they take a little bit longer to break down. I'll get more into the decomposition stuff later. And one thing that I really like to use at home composting is cardboard or paper. So think of like the inside of like a toilet paper roll or a pizza box. You can just shred that up. Those are going to be more high carbon materials. On the other side, high nitrogen materials, those materials are going to be a little bit more wet in nature. So they also are going to get a little bit stinky if they sit longer. If you leave some leaves out, eventually leaves will just turn into compost if you leave them just on the ground on their own. But generally, if you've got a bag of dry leaves, you will not smell them. But on the nitrogen side, that stuff like banana peels, I've got a tray of fruit here, like it's coming into the summer, your watermelon rinds, they're going to get stinky, coffee. You're going to find that those smell a little bit more. So some examples, food waste, manure, and grass clippings. Those are all pretty high in nitrogen content. So in order to, I saw someone ask, how do you avoid the bad smell when you're composting food leftovers? It's about getting that ratio, that carbon to nitrogen ratio right. So Terrie, could you go to the next one? Yeah, perfect. So what is the right ratio and how do you prevent those smells? Generally, and this is just a general, again, I mentioned you can get crazy with mixtures. You want 1 part green to 3 parts brown material. So what that's going to do is the nitrogen is going to mix with the carbon material, and then we'll talk about air and what that will do for you as well. But if your compost starts to get too smelly, you've got a lot of high nitrogen materials, and so you need to add in some brown materials like cardboard or wood chips, leaves, paper, and 3:1 general ratio. Terrie, you have anything to add with that? No.
Nope.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. So I mentioned briefly on the wood chip side that, did someone have a question? Sorry. I mentioned briefly on the wood chip slide that wood chips take a little bit longer to break down just because they're thicker. They're a really good brown material, but they do take a lot longer to break down. So each individual material is has its own general like carbon to nitrogen ratio. And Terrie pulled this really cool sciencey cheat sheet, which helps explain that. So you'll see wood chips all the way at the bottom right. So 600 to 1 is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And items or materials that have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio will break down a lot slower. So they'll decompose slower. So one thing that you'll see up here is kind of gross, I don't want to say it, but poultry carcasses is 4:1. So that will break down a lot quicker. And I'm not necessarily we're not going to touch on this in the presentation today, but there are different processes that the, I don't know the name of the department with the city or the county, but like roadkill, there's different composting processes that they sometimes use in order to manage that. So that's important to know as well when you're mixing things into your compost. You can Google the individual if you're curious, if you want to get really nerdy and sciencey, the individual carbon to nitrogen ratio. This is just an example of some common stuff.
Yeah, and for this, I like to show this as well, because when we talk about high nitrogen or high carbon, these things that have relatively high nitrogen doesn't mean that they have no carbon. So you still have 4:1 on a poultry carcass, but it's considered really high nitrogen just because in comparison to the wood chips, it does have a lot more nitrogen, but it doesn't mean that there's no carbon. So just keeping that in mind.
And I think I talked about all of this, but the decomposition rate. So quicker decomposition are going to be materials with lower carbon to nitrogen ratios. And this is because the microorganisms that are really starting to heat up the pile and decompose things, those are really looking for those nitrogen heavy materials. And if you want to slow the decomposition down, you'll add more brown materials. On the flip side, for slower decomposition, that's if you've got something that's just mostly brown material. Every year I do a little pile of test leaves on, we have a concrete slab at the back of our house, and I'll do a little test pile of leaves and just leave the leaves there. And it takes almost a year, just leaves, just on their own, just laying there to break down because they're just higher in carbon. But if you would want to speed that up to give those microorganisms something else to chew on, you could add some greens into it to speed up that process. So if you're noticing with your garden waste that you want it to turn into compost a little bit quicker, just look at what you're adding into it versus brown nitrogen, carbon, brown materials, or green nitrogen materials.
Yeah, and this is a really great slide too when considering just how your compost pile is working through. So this quicker composition portion is really where, if it's going too quick, is when you're going to start not making friends with your neighbors. So your quicker composition is where it can be a little bit stinkier. But there's really easy ways, just like what Megan had said, like adding more browns to slow it down, or adding more greens if it's not moving quick enough.
And And then just a little cheat sheet if you want to take a screenshot of this. Also, it's being recorded, so you can come back to it at any point, but just a little cheat sheet of nitrogen materials versus carbon materials. And then again, just the 3 parts brown to 1 part green is a general rule of thumb when you're doing your own at-home composting. We'll go through some of the different types here in a little bit of how you want to compost it, but when you're thinking about the inputs, the feedstock materials, that's really the most important thing when you're thinking about your compost. So we, again, are super passionate about the food waste side, but food waste alone doesn't make compost. So you really have to be mindful of what else you're mixing with it to really get that healthy nutrient diversity.
So specific to backyard composters, Megan, is this where we could talk about maybe what not to compost, things that we shouldn't be putting back there?
Yeah. I would strongly suggest if you are doing backyard composting to avoid meat and dairy and like those poultry carcasses that I mentioned before. A lot of that stuff is going to attract unwanted rodents and critters to your pile. Those are most of the things that I would say not to compost in your backyard. Another thing is I'm super hype right now on compostable cups because it's better than plastic, and people still, instead of bringing like their own mugs, sometimes we always encourage bring your own mug if you can. When you're filling up coffee anywhere, but if you can't, that's cool. So compostable cups are definitely something that is becoming on trend right now. But a lot of those cups, you'll see they say industrial composting only. They require a lot more heat to break down than what you would likely get at your own at-home composting bin. So that's something else just to be mindful. You might just notice that it's not actually breaking down. It's just getting kind of like melty and warped. And that's unfortunately kind of normal for backyard composting just because of the heat component.
Yeah, and just as a little fact bomb, 91% of plastics, single-use plastics, water bottles, utensils, plates, those kinds of things, 91% never get recycled. It's virgin plastic, goes directly into the landfill. And there's also a lot of resources that kind of break down even more like what you can and cannot compost. I know that Allen County Department of Environmental Management has some really good resources out there. And then of course, following social media for Megan will help guide you a little bit as well too.
So that heat we were talking about, hot versus cold composting. I know that I'm going to start with hot just because that's more what I focus on. And I'm also probably, it looks like Mark joined, going to have Mark, like I mentioned before, jump in with some plugs here too. But for hot composting, that's something where you're really looking for your piles to get above 130 degrees. So really hot, and you want that to be maintained for a minimum of 3 days. Ideal process would be that it stays that way for 7 days and you're turning it in between. And when you're turning it, you're taking all of those microorganisms and you're flipping them on top of the stuff that isn't really broken down yet. And I put on here just a quicker compost turnaround time. So when the compost is hot, it's just the microorganisms are gonna really kick it into high gear. On the opposite side, you've got cold composting. And that's more of the lazy backyard composting kind of that Terrie was saying. I'm thinking you're doing a lasagna method, but I don't know. I could be wrong.
Oh no, I'm totally lazy. We just dump.
Cool. So it's really a passive process, which is really nice because it's something that's super simple that you can just do and you're still having an impact, like a positive impact on the environment. It just takes a longer time to get that finished compost. So if you're doing it and you're like, I don't really care about when I get the compost, I just want, to not have it go to the landfill, this is an amazing way to do it. And then Terrie or Mark, did you have anything on temperature to add? No.
Yeah, when it comes to the heat production, when it comes to backyard, you can like go out there with thermometers and test what you're at. And this is also an opportunity to make sure that like if you put anything that may have diseases or any kind of weed seeds, getting to those temperatures will destroy some of those things and make it so that your compost is a little bit more safe to use. And when I say diseases, I mean like plant diseases. I'm not talking human diseases. And then that cold, it takes a longer time. And that passive is also like where we might get a little stinkier, where we might have some foul smells that our neighbors might complain about. Currently I have it towards the alley, so I don't have to worry as much about it. And my one house next to me is condemned and the other one is a Burmese family. So I promise there's some other smells coming from their backyards too, from their composting that we compete with. But it's that heat production though is important for the breakdown, but also to make sure it's a little bit safer.
And this does a really good job of explaining just kind of what's happening with the temperature, but then also with the different bacteria, microorganisms that are working and actually turning what was food waste or other organic material into the compost. So for the active composting, you'll be able to see that there's like a huge spike in there for the bacteria as the temperature goes up. And then as the temperature goes down, just the same sort of line, the bacteria function also goes down. And it's important to note the 3 different stages here. So there's active composting, which again, depending on the type that you're doing. So if you're doing the hot, this is kind of more focused on like the hot composting, but you really want to see those temperatures spike to remove any pathogens, to remove any weed seeds, and to get those microorganisms really doing their job. And then you'll leave it to cure. And then you'll see the temperatures kind of drop back down. I think, is that temperature on the side?
Yeah, in degrees Celsius.
Very cool. Put my chat box there, so now I can't see.
Yeah. And this too, like it just shows where I love seeing the graph of where the different things are, and especially the bacteria. Not all bacteria are bad. So these are the ones that we want to harness for their power to be able to break down our compost.
Someone, I think Nikki, I hope I said that right. Nikki just asked a good question about grass clippings and the heat. So if I add grass clippings every time I mow, should I be adding browns as well? Because it's always hot. So it depends on, I hate to say it depends, but it depends on how much you have. And then if your compost is kind of cooling down in between, if you're making one big pile, it should be fine. Definitely add in at least a little bit of brown material, because those grass clippings are going to be that high nitrogen, and you want to make sure that it's getting enough of the carbon to really make that good mixture. But yeah, if you want to just keep adding it to the same pile, you're going to have a really awesome compost pile at the end of it, at the end of the summer. And yeah, just add in some browns and keep turning it, here we go.
Well, can I interject a little bit and explain maybe a little bit more about the carbon and nitrogen? So it's not just this magical thing that we've decided is important for composting. So it has to do with that bacteria that we showed over here. So bacteria require nitrogen to be able to reproduce and to be able to have their generations go on and on and on. So if and you saw before that it's always a large amount of carbon, but that nitrogen is necessary for them to be living, breathing bacteria. So we want to make sure that we have that nitrogen so we can continue those generations of bacteria. So that's really at the core of it, the importance of it, so that we can build up our little armies of bacteria through having that nitrogen. And if there isn't enough, they just don't live. Like that's what they need to exist. So that's what we're trying to do with having that carbon to nitrogen ratio.
And then when thinking about the stinky or the smelly stuff as well, the third item on the list of 4 that we talked about at the beginning is air. So there's aerobic, versus anaerobic digestion. And aerobic is when oxygen is present in your pile. Anaerobic is when there's minimal oxygen present. So there's still some oxygen, it's just starting to get suppressed. And for the hot composting, where you're turning it, you're still adding your materials, not necessarily the passive cold composting technique. You're going to want to turn your piles to get your oxygen levels back up. So when you first put all of your materials into your composter, there's little spaces in between. There's little spaces in between the different materials, just because they haven't really settled down on top of one another yet. So you've got a little bit more oxygen in between those spaces. And then during your composting process, they start to merge together, your pile shrinks down. And actually, as you're composting, your input materials end up turning into about a quarter. The output material is about a quarter of the size of the input material. So it shrinks down significantly. So as that happens, as the materials start to shrink down and the oxygen pockets decrease, you're going to want to turn it to add more oxygen in. That will help break down the pathogens quicker. So you're speeding that heat up and you're getting it really covered. The heat will get covered, the microbes, which are the heat, will get covered over more of the material. And then that will keep the heat more consistent. For the anaerobic digestion, that's where the oxygen will fall below 5%. So there's still, again, some oxygen present and available, but really minimal. You'll get undesirable odors, and then this will take up to a year at least to compost fully. It's just a slower process. And then kind of jumping back to that landfill example that we gave at like the very beginning, that's an anaerobic process. So there's no oxygen that's being, at least that I know of yet, being added into the landfill during its breakdown process. So the materials are just turning into kind of like a goo and seeping down. So it's definitely more stinky. And that's kind of why people say garbage smells. It's generally that stuff breaking down without air.
And with that anaerobic, isn't that also where the greenhouse gases get created and released into the atmosphere, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So there's methane that gets released from the breakdown of you've got the particles that are the microbes that are essentially like farting and releasing the methane out. I don't really know how to say that more technically.
No, that's beautiful.
So the methane is releasing out versus the carbon dioxide. When you're turning it and you're adding that air in, you're encouraging the things to break down together, which is much less potent. If you're not familiar, methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide.
Okay. There's a question from Pam.
Yeah.
So
the contradiction between the speeding up of the breaking down. So the green materials will speed up, the nitrogen heavy materials will speed up the process of breaking down. And I think there was confusion because the question before was, if you just do grass clippings, should you add some brown material? And you should, to balance that out, because you want to have a healthier base for the nitrogen and carbon to pair together, so that it's not decomposing too quickly. You're getting more of that little curve that you can kind of see here. But the green materials, the nitrogen materials, are the ones that are going to speed up the breaking down process, not the brown. Brown will slow it down, kind of like a little rhyme. Brown slows down. Okay, jumping back in, and thank you for the questions, guys. This is really helpful because we're talking and sometimes don't realize when we say things that are contradictory, and we don't want to leave you confused. So thank you for asking the questions. This is a little graph here of similar to the heat. You'll kind of see the spiking here, but the oxygen demand rate. So what the microbes, the microbes are breathing things. And so they want to have the oxygen to be able to take it in so that they can do their thing. So what you'll see here is as those microbes like spike up at the beginning, just like with the heat, that's where you're getting the oxygen demand rate increased. And then as it goes down, as it's curing and getting more finite, the microbes are settling in a little more. That's when sometimes people will ask if they just throw worms into their composting, is that worm composting, but the worms will start to show up more in this curing storage part of the graph. That's when you'll get more of the bigger, larger microbes in your compost. Moisture content, 50 to 60%. There's fancy tools for this. You'll see the picture on the right where you can test your moisture. There's also like a bunch of other testing. I think that Joel and Mike might talk about this at the end as well, testing kits, but there's testing for pretty much everything like pH, nitrogen levels, carbon levels, calcium levels, phosphorus levels. But the very scientific way to tell if your compost is ready is what I do, at least, is you put it into your hand and you squeeze it. The compost mixture, it'll feel like a little damp, but it won't feel sopping wet and it won't feel super dry. Should be like a sponge. And if you don't want to touch it, you can put it in like a little baggie and then squeeze it as well to see. But that's just a lot of times people ask like, okay, I've been composting and I've got a different unit system, but how do I tell when it's done and when I can use it? And this is kind of the best way, but you can also buy a fancy tool as well. And then similarly, these graphs, I'm sure now you're seeing, they kind of all look the same. They've got that spike during the active composting, but the moisture will be highest when it is actually going through the breakdown process, and then it'll start to decrease. And then as it gets into storage, it'll be less moist as well. And that comes from the breakdown of those nitrogen heavy materials when we were talking about the leaching. So I think there's a note here as well. Anaerobic conditions will happen if there is greater than 65% moisture. And that's just, again, because there's no air for it to break down. And this is kind of a summary of everything that we talked about together. So there's 3 different columns here for active composting, curing, and then I need to figure out how to get this chat box away. Storage. Okay, I saw the P and not the S. I was like, I think it should say storage. So oxygen concentration, that will be relatively the same throughout, that 13 to 18%. I don't know what FAS means. Terrie?
Oh man, I would have to look at the article again. I knew like a year ago when I found it.
Okay. Particle size. So this is where you'll start to see, actually, this is a really good point. So particle size, some compost, some finished compost that you'll see, like the stuff, like I mentioned before, I work with Mark and Free Airspace. Thanks. Someone typed that in the chat.
Thank you.
The particle size that you see when you have compost that is more like what I'm working with Mark on right now, it looks really pretty and it's really fine. He has something that is a screener. So it goes through and it jiggles out all of the, like, we call it overs, but all of the larger particles, they get sifted out, and then those can get tossed back into the compost pile. But if you're composting at home, you might notice when you get your finished product, you're like, wow, this still kind of looks chunky. And that's totally normal. You can make your own screeners at home just out of chicken wire and wood and sift out some of those smaller particles. But that's where you'll see the disparity here between 3 millimeter and 50 millimeter particles. Like, it can be really fine if you screen it really well, or it can be a little bit bigger. Carbon to nitrogen ratios. So that will be the most at the beginning. So 25 carbon to 1, and then you'll slowly start to see that go down. And that's just because more nitrogen is being stored into the compost itself as you get down into the product storage, like optimal levels of what you're looking for in your finished soil amendment. And then moisture content, again, it'll be a little bit more moist at the beginning, and then slowly you'll do that squeeze test to see if it's really feeling like a little spongy. And it will get a little bit drier too. Like during the summertime, it's been, actually today's beautiful, but it's been kind of hot randomly the past couple of days with the sun beating on it. It can get a little dry, and you know, the microbes are still there. But if you've got your large heap of compost, it's all working together, so that will still carry some moisture in it. The temperature, when you're breaking down, this is in Celsius, so again, it's going to be about 130 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit during active composting for hot composting. And then as it's curing, you'll start to see that temperature just like take a dip. So if you do have, there's a thermometer company that I use, it's called Rio Temp, REO Temp. They're really cool. They're like really long. It's like a big meat thermometer, but way longer. You can put it in your compost pile. You'll start to see that temperature just like taper off, and it'll be closer to around 90 degrees Fahrenheit is when I notice mine just like, okay, it's done. And then when it's storing, it'll just get to whatever temperature you've got outside. And then pH, again, soil and water conservation, we're always looking for more of, just in a general compost, I'm going to make that preface, we're looking for more of a neutral pH balance, which is around 7. There are some people that do very specific soil for their plants that they're growing. So I have heard a request from some people that are growing berries, that like berry farmers, like acres of berries, that are looking for some soil that's more acidic. I'm not really familiar with that, like desire to have more acidic soil, but I do know that there is a request for some weird large crops that people have pH that they'd like on the more acidic side or the more basic side, but generally you're shooting for a pH of 7 and you're just at home backyard composting.
There's a couple of questions. So one, pine needles, green or brown. Just like with grass, if you are taking green pine needles, then those would be considered a green. But if they have already fallen off and they're brown and they've dried out, then they're considered a brown. And then Megan, did you want to talk about chunky compost versus a fine sifted compost?
You can add chunky compost. We add chunky compost. It still grows. It just doesn't look pretty. And some people are very particular about wanting it to look like very pretty, but it depends. And then Mark answered in here as well. Thank you, Mark. He answered, it depends on what chunks are composed of. If they're woody, then chunks can change the balance of the pH. So that's good to know.
And then Allen County asked, how would you make your compost more acidic?
Hey, Mark, can you unmute yourself? Are you on?
Am I unmuted?
Yes,
Yes.
you are. This is Mark.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. Got a very poor internet connection today. So anyway, yes, I can see the questions coming through,
Okay, cool.
but everything else is kind of foggy out here today. I'm out in the country where I make the compost. So anyway, to make it more acidic, grass clippings help a lot. Excess, if you can, or well, the pH changes right from the beginning of your, as the temperatures rise, the pH changes dramatically as well. Actually, the pH at the beginning goes clear from the acidic level all the way into the alkaline level. In fact, it can go as high as 12. So, and then as it starts to cure, the pH starts coming back down. So depending on when you want to call your compost finished, you can actually test the pH. And Megan said, if you get down to a pH of 7, you're pretty well perfect. But to make it get into the pH range on the acidic level, if you use more things like grass clippings and food waste will help to bring the pH down over time.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark.
So I don't know if you're hearing what I'm saying or if it's all going foggy.
We heard. Thank you.
Yeah, and I do want to acknowledge too, with all of you out there that are doing your soil tests and adding amendments, generally we tend to see the soil in this area be pretty high. So I think that's probably I would like to know how to get more acidic compost as well, just because that's really what our soils need. Many of our soils, the pH is just too stinking high to do a lot of the things we want to do in it.
I think kind of on that same vein, I've had a lot of people ask me that are at home composting. They've read articles where they shouldn't be putting citrus or like oranges and lemons and limes and stuff like that into their compost. But I actually wasn't familiar that the soil now I am aware that the soil in our area is too high. So I would say don't be afraid to put in those lemon peels and orange peels then as it's breaking down. Like, it will add a little bit more acidity, but if things are a little bit more basic here, then I would say don't be afraid to add those into your own pile.
And this would also be a point. So a lot of people, when they're composting, if it starts getting too stinky, especially like with people with horses, they'll add lime to the manure. That would be not a great thing, because lime increases that pH, and it'll make it even more basic when we're looking to lower the pH of our soils. And then there's a question about adding sulfur to lower pH. If you're gonna add sulfur because you need a lower pH, I would recommend just adding it to your soil versus the compost. What do you think, Megan or Mark?
Yeah, I would say not to your compost.
Okay. Yeah, because that'll mess with the bacteria that are doing their jobs. Yeah. Right? Great. All right. Do we want to make it easier?
Composting made easier. We went over a bunch of stuff. And again, we'll have the cheat sheets available for you. We can pass it to Mike and Joelle to post as well, just the browns versus the greens, so that you can have an easy cheat sheet. But just to make it a lot easier, if it's stinky, which means it's too hot, you're going to add more brown material and you're going to turn it, give it more oxygen, give it more air. If it's not breaking down, so you just look, and I've had this question a lot actually this year so far. If it's not breaking down and you're like, why is it sleeping? It's too cold. You're gonna want to add more greens to really wake it back up, and then do that same thing where you're gonna turn it. If it's dry, so again, it's been dry the past week here, and if you notice that your compost is just looking really dry, because maybe it does have more browns than greens too, add some water into it. We'll talk about more of the units that you can use for composting, but I like to have my units generally under some trees. So there's some shade, but there's still ways for water to get into them as well. Just at-home units is what I'm talking about now. And then just mix it every now and again. Even if you're doing a lazy backyard composting, just like go give it a little nudge, a little turn with a pitchfork. It doesn't hurt it. It helps. And then you're keeping that oxygen level hopefully above 5%, so that it's not necessarily leaching down into the ground, but really adding in that healthy microbe activity. Oh, there's an important note I just noticed at the bottom too. Make sure you know what you're putting into your compost, and that it's free from toxic or harmful residues or substances. Again, we'll talk about the different units here in a second, but it's important to use non-treated stuff if you're using wood, just like you would for gardening, I'm sure. But you want to make sure that you're using just like natural stuff. You're not putting anything toxic into your compost.
Yeah, and this is true too for any of the like yard trimmings or anything else, that there are some herbicides that have residual. So that means that they will the properties of that herbicide will then transfer to your soil. So just keeping that in mind, that there are some that can stay in the products for up to 18 months and can then have negative effects to the things that you're planting. So that's kind of to where I was going with that note, of just making sure that if you do apply things that have been used with or have been applied with pesticides or herbicides, make sure you know it and know what the residuals are. So next I want to talk about some of the different composting options that we have. So we talked about the science of composting and got a little nerdy with some of the oxygen levels in water and all of these things. Now, like, this is an opportunity for us to go over some of the different ways that you might be able to bring composting into your own backyard or farm. And there are so many options. These are just some of them. So just to peek some ideas. So one of the more common things that are used are holding units. So you'll see there's a couple of different options here using wood pallets. And then there's also like a pre-made holding unit. So this makes sure that things stay contained. Like Megan had said earlier, making sure that the materials that you're using are safe from any contaminants. With pallets, a lot of them can be treated with different chemicals to reduce breakdown, or depending on what industry they were used on, they could leach different toxic chemicals. So just making sure that the materials that you're using are clean and won't harm the little bacteria that are doing their jobs. And this is a way to, especially in the city, this kind of holding unit works really well to contain and keep away some of the critters, at least more of the smaller enclosed units. There are also turning units. So they hold things similar to the holding units or the enclosed, but these then make it a lot easier for you to do that aeration, to do that turning. So you don't have to get out there with a pitchfork, because that can be really a challenge as well, is getting out there and turning the unit. Like for me, it's hard for me to turn it sometimes, especially if it's been entirely too long. So this is a way for you to be able to introduce the air into those pockets and make sure that it's not getting stagnant. But these turning units also will make finished compost really, really quickly. As quickly as what, like 3 months, Megan? Do you have much experience with turning units?
During the summer, if you're really getting it heated, one of the ones that I like is the one on the far left with a double inputs. During the summer, it can happen in 3 to 6 months, just in the one unit. So that's why these double units are becoming pretty popular, because once you reach capacity in like the unit on the left, then you'll start adding your raw materials to the unit on the right. And then that one on the left during the summer months can be ready in 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, and it's right, and making sure that you understand what works best for you. So having those dual units are becoming more popular, because people have found out that when you have a single holding unit, you can't use it for a while until it is broken down. But there's lots of, so you can see the really fancy ones with branding on the left side, all the way to DIY. So there's so much variety in what you can do, and also use a little ingenuity. Like an old trash can with some bungee cords works. Or you can spend, or you can spend some dollars and let somebody else do the work and put it together. But there's tons of options online as well. The heaps and the windrows are really where this is like the lazy, I do the heap. It's more of a pile. So, and that's what it is. There's nothing that contains it at all. And then windrows is a way that's used. The windrows is on the left, is a method that's used a lot with bigger composters. So Megan, did you want to talk about your windrows that you use?
I would, if Mark can unmute himself, like for him to talk about, because it's his windrows. He's instrumental in this. Mark, are you able to unmute yourself again?
I'm hoping.
Yep.
Still got a bad connection. But yes, we have 6 acres of windrows. They're 10 feet wide and 5 feet tall at the beginning. And by the time they're done composting, they're basically than half of what they started out as. Sometimes even end up only with 1/3 of finished compost. Of course, we begin with the proper nitrogen carbon ratios, and we turn it somewhere between 5 and 20 times during the 12-week active composting process. Our temperatures will range starting at ambient temperature all the way up to, we make sure we turn before it gets to the 170 degrees. We try to keep it at 160. and between 150, 160 for 15 days. Actually, we have to do, instead of that 3-day period, the kill process or whatever. We do end up with disease-free, weed-free, and insect-free, but just for a short period of time. What happens after it matures is it's the perfect place for weed seeds to germinate into again. So if we were to be able to sell it all at the 10-week, 12-week old period of time, you'd have weed-free product. But since we make about 15,000 yards a year, it's a little tough to sell that much before it has actually cured and matured, and now weed seed just blows in from all the acres around, and we then keep the weeds turned under. But you will have an active, depending on how much compost you use, you will have weeds to contend with down the line. But with the compost, they pull very easily. And again, our compost is organic. So if you haven't using the compost that Megan and I are building as product.
And I think the weed seed thing that Mark just mentioned is also important to note for all of the other types of composting as well. Like as soon as, I can't remember if it was on this webinar or a webinar through Purdue that I was on a couple, maybe 2 months ago now. But the weeds go towards open dirt. Like they just like see open dirt as a buffet. And so if you do leave your pile out after it's done just on the ground, especially right now, like this is prime time for weeds to just do their gross thing. They will find a spot because they're looking to, someone called them the first responders on whatever webinar I was on. And I was like, that's so true, because they take root quick and they're just looking to cover the dirt. They don't want it to be bare. So just be mindful of that too when you're taking your own compost out of your unit. And then, like Mark said, we turn it on his farm. He turns it, and he has this cool tractor thing. I've posted it on my Instagram a couple times if you're curious to see what it looks like. But these piles are huge, and it's awesome.
Sweet. So that's Windrows in heaps. Another option, and this is really helpful for backyard gardeners, is doing the in situ. So here's an example of like sheet, the in situ composting. So, or this would also be where you could see like the lasagna gardening that a lot of people do, where you add in different layers of like wood chips and newspaper and cardboards and compost and all of these beautiful things. So this would be an example of in situ. And you can see here in the picture that they are laying down newspapers as a composting and weed barrier. And then we have a short little video about the different kinds of in situ composting.
Hello! You've caught me clearing the last of the bean crop. At the end of the growing season, piles of cleared crops like this are a common sight. But what to do with them all? You could just add all this material to the compost heap, but an alternative is to simply leave it right here on the ground. Called in situ composting, this is a fantastic way of building up the soil fertility for next year's crops. In this video, we'll show you how to do it.
Composting in situ is a great way to cope with lots of spent crops or sodden gluts of kitchen waste, for example when processing fruits and vegetables for winter storage. Composting directly on or in the ground can divert organic material away from overflowing compost heaps, while directly improving the ground for next year's crops. Finer materials such as annual weeds, carrot tops and vegetable peelings decompose relatively fast. You can simply lay this material on the soil surface before covering it over with a thin layer of well-rotted garden compost or manure. This is a simple but effective way to supplement traditional end-of-season applications of organic matter. By spring, the material should have rotted down into the ground, leaving behind a beautifully rich surface ready for sowing or planting. Compost ingredients can also be buried in trenches to improve the nutrient content and moisture holding capacity of the soil. To make a compost trench, simply dig out a trench about a foot or 30 centimetres deep. Compost trenches are commonly prepared for vegetables like climbing beans that are grown in rows. The rich, moisture-retentive soil left behind will ensure plenty of produce over the cropping period. With the trench dug, simply fill it up with your compost ingredients. Suitable ingredients include annual weeds which haven't flowered, grass clippings, the chopped up remains of spent crops, and kitchen waste such as apple cores or vegetable peelings. Fill to at least 4 inches or 10 centimetres deep, then cover over with a layer of leaves or grass clippings. Fill the remainder of the trench with the excavated soil. If you plan to plant a row of crops directly on top of the trench and need to locate it in spring, simply mark the position of each end so you can easily find it in a few months' time. Compost pits use the same principle as trenches. Dig a hole, fill it with your organic waste, and cover with a topping of grass clippings or leaves. You can space multiple compost pits in close proximity, creating pockets of nutrient-rich material that will feed the microbes and worms in the surrounding soil. Compost pits are great for creating nutrient-rich and moisture-retentive reservoirs for thirsty and hungry plants such as zucchini or courgettes, squash or tomatoes. Plant directly on top of pits that were made in the autumn, or dig and fill fresh pits in spring, then set one or more plants immediately next to or encircling each pit. As the material rots down, it will feed the soil to encourage healthy, resilient growth and bumper yields.
As you can see, composting in situ offers a convenient way of processing all that nutrient-rich organic matter back into the ground. It's easy to do, and next year's crops will love you for it. As always, we'd love to hear your experiences of composting in this way, so do drop us a comment below. And we'll be bringing you more green gardening ideas over the coming months.
So this is one of the, with the in situ composting, just keep in mind, like looking at how they described it, they weren't very clear about it, but we need to make sure that there's that good carbon to nitrogen ratio too. Like look at how they're like, put all these things on and then cover with more green things, because we want to make sure that we're not putting in a lot of that high carbon materials, because if we try to grow next to that, the decomposition of those things will then pull away nitrogen that our plants may eventually need. So keeping that in mind when you're doing this kind of composting, but it's a really interesting way to be able to not have to worry about this entire heap that you have. So does anyone have any questions about the in situ? I don't want to get too nerdy about it. All right. So next I want to talk about some insect husbandry sorts of composting. So one of the most common ones that we hear about is the vermicomposting. So vermicomposting is using the power of worms to be able to break it down. So essentially what you're doing is just like any other animal, we are feeding this animal and we're getting the manure that comes out of it, and we're using that as compost. The great thing about the vermicomposting is that we don't have to worry about curing or allowing it to compost afterwards. But there's really expensive units that you can buy. So on the right here is a picture of a pre-made vermicomposting kit that you can make with different levels, and it comes with all the instructions on how to be able to do it. And then there's also, just like with anything, there's DIY methods. So online, there's lots of different ways. But again, what you're doing is you're creating a home for these beautiful little creatures to go about and do their business. And then you get the compost or the compost material that you can then add to, once it's finished, you can add to houseplants, gardens, and you can use it just to supplement. This one, though, I know is a little bit lower in the nutrients. So nitrogen, you're at, so if you look at like the NPK, worm castings are usually like a 0.1 for nitrogen, so 0.1%. But it's a way just to kind of supplement some of that. And And then the other one that I wanted to bring up was black soldier fly. This is a system of using the maggots or the larva of black soldier fly to do the work for us. So similar to worms, the larvae exist in this compost system. They eat the materials and then they make this beautiful compost. So you can see the life cycle of the black soldier fly here in the left. In the middle is an adult black soldier fly. Black soldier fly are a great addition to backyard gardeners or small farms. The flies are non-biting. They don't pose a threat when they're at any stage of their life cycle. And then you can find different ways to be able to do the black soldier fly. The example on the right is similar to one that we have at Johnny May Farm that we use. It's just using a 55-gallon drum, and the larvae hang out in that drum and we feed it. The great thing about this is, so previously we were saying like you with heap or windrows or any of the backyard gardening or backyard composting is that you don't want to add meats or dairies or any of those things. With black soldier fly, they are so effective at composting that you can add meats and you can add these dairy products because they break it down really, really quickly and they don't become a nuisance. And I saw at our farm, we've got a unit, and I saw them take down like fish fillets, giant fish fillets in under about 2 hours. They're pretty effective composters.
And you might see, I just want to add one little note on the black soldier flies. I have seen them I have a couple of units at my house still. So I'm doing a lot of composting with Mark, but I still have some units at my house and I've seen black soldier flies out. So you might just see them naturally in your own compost when you're doing a heap pile at your own house, because I don't know where they're coming from. Maybe they're coming from Johnny May, but yeah. I don't know. But yeah, I've seen a couple, so they're really cool.
Yeah, and they're used a lot in manure operations as well because they can take that manure and make it into a usable product pretty quickly. And there are downfalls to all of these. Like I know with black soldier fly, a lot of you put a lot of inputs in, you don't get a lot of outputs because so much of the material they take in is converted into them creating themselves into bigger creatures. And so there's a question, are black soldier flies native? I've heard conflicting information on that one. So I don't know if they are truly native, but I know that they naturally exist here, so they might be naturalized, but don't quote me on that. And then I wanted to talk about one fun composting option. It's called a biomealer. And what it is you're using it's essentially a heater that is made out of composting materials, because we talked about with composting that they create so much heat. And at this point, it's a byproduct. So people have discovered that you can take these composters and create like an actual heater to be able to use to heat buildings that we have. It's used a lot by small farmers to be able to add supplemental heat to their greenhouses. But here is a short little video on what is a biomealer and how they work.
What is a biomealer? Biomealers are very simple systems consisting of water and wood chips or other organic material. The material is contained by a wire fence. The water pipe is coiled within the large pile of organic matter. A circulation pump then withdraws the energy created from the composting process. As you may or may not know, during the composting process, bacteria convert organic matter into heat, carbon dioxide, and ammonium. A biomealer's function is to extract the heat produced from this process. During this chemical reaction, the composting material's temperature will stabilize around 50 degrees Celsius, making biomealers one of the most economic solutions to generate clean heating energy. Biomealers can be linked into any type of underfloor heating system. Underfloor heating systems are very common. They heat people's houses, shops, and many other large structures such as schools, colleges, universities, grocery stores, convenience stores, restaurants, factories, and other industrial buildings. Any building using underfloor heating systems can be equipped with a biomealer to save them money on heating and reduce their dependency on fossil fuels. Let's consider for a moment the drawbacks of biomanures. Biomanures produce carbon dioxide and ammonia. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that is causing global warming. So do we really want to implement systems that create more carbon dioxide? Are they really creating more? We have to consider the abundance of organic waste materials we're producing every day. These materials are free, except for the cost of transportation, and would otherwise be composting naturally, releasing carbon dioxide and wasting their heating potential. Biomanures capitalize on this natural process. The ammonium is broken down by bacteria into nitrogen compounds useful for improving soil quality. A biomanure is, after all, a large pile of compost, and when the chemical reaction is finished, we are left with a gigantic pile of soil-building material. The compost can then be sold, traded, or given away to local farmers and gardeners. Bringing biomanures into a community will increase its food security and create bonds and opportunities that would otherwise not be present. Biomanures have a limited lifespan, around 12 to 18 months, meaning that each year the old one will have to be taken down and a new one constructed in its place. It's a lot of work, taking a team of 3 to 8 people and a machine most of the day to install one. Currently, most biomanure construction takes advantage of workshop structures, meaning that people are paying to work and learn how to build them. Surely this will shift as demand for them increases. Moving into a world where job loss is becoming more common, food security is a major issue, and climate change our greatest threat, understanding all of our options is vital. Biomanures may not work everywhere or in every instance, but they are a very powerful tool to be used in our transition towards a more sensible civilization. For more information on biomanures, please visit the links provided.
All right, who wants to build a biomaler? I'm sold. So I'm going to go back to this picture and just reiterate. So what it is you're building a giant compost pile, and within it there's these layers. So in this picture you can see the layers of this tubing. So what they do is they use it like a water heater, and it's all of this tubing is going to be filled with water, and it's going to be at different layer at different points within the pile, and it's going to get circulated through, and then that hot water then will come back, just like with some of our like hot water furnaces that we see in older buildings. It'll be used then to be able to heat different buildings. And it's I think I saw one, a home build a biomealer here in the West Central Fort Wayne. But it's used a lot like in greenhouses. So you put it right next to the greenhouse, and then you can use it to be able to heat your greenhouse. And it's a way to be able to use waste products as well, because a lot of times it's using those wood chips that you may have to use to clear out land. But everybody needs a biomealer. So those are some of the different options. And like I said, there's many more out there. Next, we wanted to talk a little bit about the benefits of composting. Just now that you guys know it, like really let's dive into what composting can do. So one of the things that is really important, especially for gardeners and farmers, is providing those nutrients. So the compost works as a nutrient source for both the macro and the micronutrients. So those macronutrients are the NPK, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. And then the micronutrients are everything else. So depending on what kind of compost you have will decide what kind of micronutrients are in there and the levels of the macronutrients. But it's a way to be able to reduce your dependency on chemical fertilizers as well. It's a way to be able to have that nutrient cycle within your own yard too, so that you don't have to bring in outside inputs to be able to make your plants grow really healthy. It closes the nutrient loop, so to speak. And it can also help increase that cation exchange capacity. So when you guys get your soil tests and they show on there what your CEC is, your cation exchange capacity, it tells us what the nutrient holding capacity is of your soil, the nutrients that we have, and how strong the soil is holding on to it. So with talking about cation exchange capacity, it's something that you can get in a lot of soil health classes. So I'm not even going to try to discuss what those mean, but it's just whether or not your soil is holding onto your nutrients really, really strongly or not at all. And it'll be an indicator of whether or not you've got leaching within your soil. Megan or Mark, anything to add about these specific benefits of composting?
No, I think you have.
All I can say is cation exchange is the whole basis for everything. If you don't have a good cation exchange, you don't have a good soil and or a good compost.
Correct. Yeah. It's something that we want to make sure that, and through that compost, we can make sure to increase that cation exchange capacity. Yeah. So also with composting, it's a way for us to improve that soil structure, to make sure, again, it's all about that soil. So it doesn't matter what your plants look like. If we don't have a really healthy soil, it's not going to produce really healthy plants, which is really what we're trying to do here. And it's this, you have to consider both. So having that improved soil structure, it can increase the aggregate stability. So it can, we want soils that are easily workable, but we also want soils that kind of hold together too, right? So because with that, it helps to resist with erosion. We don't want it to be flying away with our water and air that comes over the soils. And we want to try to improve that soil aeration. So when it comes to plants, we want to be able to allow those plant roots to be able to go through and penetrate that soil and grow really, really well, because if we impede the roots of those plants because we don't have really great soil, the plants won't grow as well. But it also helps allow that excess water to drain off too. So that when we get those big rain events, especially in the spring, it gives the soil the capacity to be able to percolate that water through that soil profile. So it's not sitting stagnant in one area. But then also on the flip side, adding compost will help improve that water holding capacity. So we don't have a lot of issues with soils that are made of sand here, but with adding that compost, if you've got a really sandy soil, right, like sand, the water just goes right through sand. Adding compost to a soil that doesn't hold onto the water as well, adding compost will help with that. Megan, Mark, anything you want to add about that?
I think I don't want to touch too much on this because it's not directly related to composting, but the soil structure is so important for healthy growth, healthy plants. And so no-till is something that I'm like a big proponent of. But it's just that compost is amending the soil again. And it's helping put extra nutrients into that soil and stabilize the structure, but it's important for there to be a soil structure as well for it to stabilize into.
Yes. So with the composting as well, when we had showed some of those graphs of how the bacteria and fungi and all of those really great little microorganisms, when we add, you can think of compost as being like a way to be able to inoculate our soil with this activity, because we want to have living, breathing soils, right? Like that's what makes soils so great. If it's not a living and breathing organism with structure and layers, it's just then dirt. So we really want to have soil, and we can do that through adding of compost because it increases that microbial activity. Like Megan was saying, that when the compost starts to finish, that's when all of these bigger organisms come in, like our earthworms. And that's what we want to see in our soils. And there's also some studies that have shown that when you have add compost and you have this microbial activity and this diversity within your soil, it can actually resist some plant pathogens. So there's studies that have shown Pythium fusarium, Phytophthora, and Verticillium. So those are all different organisms that can cause our plants to die. and to have different diseases. So if we can have the living, breathing soils that they're resistant to some of these diseases. So I kind of equate it to like our gut health, in that like doctors recommending to take probiotics. Probiotics are just a bunch of bacteria. So they're recommending that you take bacteria so that it can bring in these beneficial things so that we can have more, we're more resistant to the ones that can cause us issue. And also with composting, adding the compost to our soil, it can increase that carbon sequestration. So when we are looking at the global climate change and all of these things that are happening, it can make it so that we can store that more of that carbon into our soil through the use of compost. And then, like we started off, it helps recycle our waste. So it reduces the amount of outputs that are going into our landfills, and it reduces that waste stream. So I think this is the last, is how do we use compost, right? Like now that we went through all of this thing, you guys are excited to use it. So how do we use it? Megan, did you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, I do want to, I see Mark answering some questions in the chat. Thank you. And I just want to like touch on those really quick before we move on, just in case someone else didn't see the questions in the chat. So someone asked a question about oils, fats, greases. Are those okay to put in your compost pile? And yes, they make good compost. Remember, they're a green material, so make sure you balance it out or it's going to get smelly with the browns. And Mark also said that in the chat too. And then someone else asked a question, which is better, topsoil or compost? And Mark answered that compost can make any soil better, including topsoil. And then there's no harm in just using your compost. So topsoil, if you're aware, if you're a gardener, your topsoil is going to be that top layer, that really pretty layer of your own soil. And when you're buying topsoil from a store, it is the top layer of earth that was taken from somewhere else that you're transporting in as your own topsoil. So if you can really use your own compost or get compost to supplement, that actually is leaving the topsoil wherever it is to help cover the ground wherever it is. Mark, did you want to add anything else? Okay, I just saw your little yellow box. I didn't know what that meant. Okay, thank you for the questions. Keep asking questions. Moving on to how to use compost. We gave a couple of little notes here. So amending and replenishing your soil, which is mostly what we've talked about thus far. Maintaining your perennial or annual beds. So that's garden beds, flower beds, erosion control, and which I put a little slide in here for erosion control, which is cool stuff. Tree and shrub planting and maintenance, and mulch. You can make it into mulch. And compost tea, which is like a hip thing as well, we'll talk about. So first, just trying to decide how much compost do you actually need to use for your garden. And this is mostly garden related, this first slide. But the first thing I wanted to say, Terrie and I talked about this slide quite a bit, making sure to test your soil first. So test your soil to become familiar with whatever soil you've got and you're using for your garden. Make sure you understand what's going into it. And then once you understand what's going into it, play around with your compost and understanding how that is actually improving your soil, what it's adding to it, what ingredients are being added into your soil.
Yeah, and I just want to interject too here in that compost isn't something that is totally free of risk as well. So over applying compost is a thing. So making sure to test your soil and making sure that you're applying what you need is super duper important, because we don't want to lose those nutrients as well and have those ecological effects. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. So amending the soil, generally, if you've already got a really healthy bed, so whether you've got a raised bed that you're using or you've got a garden on the ground, of working 1 to 2 inches of compost into the top 3 to 5 inches of your soil That will really just help give it that extra boost. And I like to mix it in just with my hands. I don't mind getting dirty, but just doing it gradually, letting it get in. And for flower beds, you can mix about 1 inch into your perennial or annual flower beds. For vegetables, I know we watched a video on the in situ composting, but there's really a lot of benefit of taking care of your garden in the fall. I know we're not there right now. We're like at the start of the season, but I do think it's really important to touch on, like, having your soil protected for the winter is really critical to having your next year's growth be really optimal. So applying layers of compost to your bed in the fall is a really great way to protect it, to get those nutrients in there. So whether that is the in situ, so the holes, whatever they call those, the holes in the ground or the trenches, whatever that looks like, or just applying some compost. And then as you're growing your plants in the spring, applying some to the base or amending that soil, like the first bullet point that we talked about, that'll be really great in making sure you get some optimal growth for this growing season.
Yeah, and for prepping in the fall, like that's an important thing to do, because the soil tends to be drier in the fall. It's easier to be able to work in. It helps maintain that soil structure a little bit better than doing it in the spring.
I added in a slide here, just it's kind of climate related, but I also thought with the group that's putting on this presentation for soil water conservation, there's some really cool stuff out there that some people are working on for erosion control. So compost berms and then compost socks are a big thing right now that some places, we are fortunate in Fort Wayne, Indiana, that we don't really see, sometimes we do see flooding and rivers overflowing, but for the most part, we don't tend to see it as frequently as other coastal cities. But some places, what they're using when they get a lot of drainage, the picture on the right is a compost sock. So there's compost material all throughout this big sock, which has holes in it. It's right at the base of a little slope. So what happens is as the water drains off, we've mentioned that compost can really retain a lot of water. So what it's doing is it's soaking up a lot of that water before you see the drain right below it, before it washes into that drain, because then all of that runoff, whether it's a field, this looks like a field, I can't really tell, but whatever is running off of that is going right into the drain, which is then going right into the water management. And so if we can use compost to prevent any of that runoff, any of those pathogens from getting into our clean drinking water, that's totally a win. And then the picture on the left just is a little drawing of what it looks like when you've got compost berms just kind of surrounding different sloped areas in order to make sure you're mitigating any runoff. And compost tea, I made these cute little, this is a plug here, I made these cute little compost tea bombs, sold them at the farmer's market this past weekend, but I did want to talk about compost tea. And compost tea, whatever amount of compost you're putting into water, if you're making compost tea, you'll leave it for about a day to 2 days. And those microbes, they're essentially getting into the water. It's the same amount of microbes that you would have had in that little bit of compost. So it's diluting them out, but it helps it go further if you want to water them. I normally use compost tea on my houseplants, my indoor houseplants during the spring, just give them a little boost. But it is the same amount of nutrients. So if you were to just take that same amount of compost that's in the little bag for the compost tea, you get the same nutrients, just more of a direct effect. And then it doesn't replace the need for a compost. So there's still always an option to do compost tea and compost. The compost has that structural element that you're not really replacing with the compost tea. Terrie, did you want to add anything to the compost tea?
It's not the cure-all that everyone says it is on the internet. So keeping in mind that everything you read on the internet's not totally true, but it is a really great way to be able to give the plants a little bit of nutrients as well.
And then where do we go from here? So I know at the beginning of the presentation, some people asked about backyard composting and what you can do. And so I made a little cheat sheet here. This was for Earth Day last year. just to try and figure out what you want to do, like how you want to do your composting. So a couple of options that Terrie went through on the left, there's static heap, which is again the turning, the tumbler, which we saw, which is the cool turning. I like that trash can one where you can just kick it with the bungee cords on. There's worm bins or black soldier flies. There's composting service, or there's an aerated heap, which I didn't put a picture of, but there's some cool, super cool stuff that people are doing right now with aerated heaps, where they're shooting pipes into a pile that's contained in a unit. They're shooting air into it to like turn it up, which is really cool. I'm kind of bummed I didn't think about that before. But across here, you'll see your time needed, how fast do you want it, how much money do you want to spend, and the amount available each year. So it really just depends on what you're looking for. There's no wrong way. Like if you're not putting your waste in the landfill, you're doing awesome. Like you're doing a million times of work better than anything else. So if you want to spend no time, one of the static heaps, or again, shameless plug, composting service, my company picks up the food waste and turns it into compost. We work with Mark. But just doing the lazy backyard composting is definitely a great way. If you want to do the trench digging and just bury your food waste, that's a great way. But if you want to get into the tumbler or the worm bins, those are also really fun. Like it's a fun activity. If you're looking for, I guess it's post-COVID, but if you're looking for a new hobby, after quarantine, the worm bins it's really kind of fun watching them digest all of the food waste. And I'm sure the black soldier flies are super cool if it ate a fish fillet sandwich in 2 hours, which is
so quick.
So quick. It's so quick. And then how fast do you want your compost? So are you looking to have your compost on your garden within the next 3 to 6 months? What does that look like? Just figuring out what you want from a money, how much money do you want to invest in your composting? Again, the lazy backyard composting is really nice. And maybe you have a backyard and you aren't in an apartment building and you can just go ahead and do that on your own. And then the amount available each year. So this is just a little cheat sheet just to give you some opportunities to kind of pick and choose what might interest you. And then some resources. So we have links. I think we can send out some links as well. But again, my name is Megan from Ground Down. Ground Down is a food scrap collection and compost company. So we have bagged compost. We can do small bulk delivery. And we have those little compost tea bombs that I just mentioned. And then I put Mark on here because some of the compost I make at my own house in these little stall units, but I ran out of space because we've got a lot of inputs that we're getting right now from households and from restaurants. So Mark Ringenberg has Ringenberg Garden House, and he has bulk compost available. Again, he does those big windrow heap turns. And there's that. DIY composting. So if you want to do it on your own, I did 2 blogs that there's links for in here for, it just goes into a little bit more detail than what we talked about even just today. Composting techniques and composting ingredients. You can find those on my website under the blog Sustainable Journey, or we can send out the links here. And then I am on social media. This is the handle for my Instagram. And if you ever have any questions, you can just email compost@grounddown.org. Literally, if it's about DIY stuff, if you want your food waste picked up, I don't care. I just want your food waste not going to the landfill, whatever that looks like. I'm happy about it. I didn't put this on here, but if you also have questions, I'm always at the Bar Street Farmers Market on Saturdays. People come by all the time and they're like, hey, my compost is smelly, like what's happening? Just come ask. Like, I'm just here to help and just want to help make the world a little bit better than how I found it.
And then for Purdue Extension, there's a lot of really great resources. So I kind of threw like everything up here. We talked earlier about soil testing. So if you're a homeowner, we do offer soil testing. You can find information on our website on how to do a soil test and then how to submit it. There is soil testing through the Soil and Water Conservation District for urban farming urban farmers and community gardens that are looking to get their soil tested. If you guys have questions about gardening, we have the Master Gardener hotline. And so you can find more information. It's an email and a phone number at bit.ly garden questions. We're always looking for master gardeners. I didn't talk much about that, but then we've got a whole bunch of different social medias for extension for master gardeners and Johnny May Farm. The master gardeners are really good at putting supplemental information on their socials as well. So we went through it. What questions do you have? Did we answer them all?
I doubt it. There's so many things.
Hey, you guys have done a great job. That's a great presentation. So I love Terry's question. What questions do you have? Let's get a discussion going here. Anybody got anything else? The SWCD has a number of things available. Like Terry said, we have an urban garden, urban agriculture grant running right now. I'll ask Joelle maybe if she wants to share something on that in a little bit. We do soil testing for it with no charge for some parameters. There's a slight charge for others. We have one of the greatest soil test labs in the country in Fort Wayne here, A&L Labs. It's really inexpensive. You can learn to pull your own soil samples, and you can get advice from us, from the extension office, from other people, the agronomists, on what it means. You can amend soils easily. Myself, I'm a farmer, a conservation farmer, restorative agriculture. I have cover crops is my thing, no-till cover crops. I plant my corn and soybeans in 4 and 5 foot tall cereal rye and other crops. So it's a great mess to farm that way. Any questions, anybody?
I see one in the chat asking about the difference between garden sanitation and versus composting. So when it comes to sanitation in the gardens, if we've got, if you're real sciencey about the composting and you make sure that the temperatures are reached for that certain amount of time and everything's aerated, and you do it very much according to the science to make sure everything is clean, then you can do it. Some of those garden residues can go into your compost system. But like for me, I'm lazy. So we want to make sure that those diseases and pests aren't carried over. So if there are any disease or pest-ridden things that you're putting into your compost, it's got to get hot enough to kill it. Otherwise, it's got to go in your trash, because we don't want to be able to have that go through. But that would be an opportunity to connect with the lawn waste facilities that we have to be able to get it so it stays out of the trash. Or you can use Megan to come pick up your garden waste stuff that's disease and pest ridden.
Yes.
Does that make sense? I feel like I meandered a little bit.
I think I got
Anything else? Maybe I'll ask Joelle here to give a quick talk on her urban ag program available, and we'll come back to anything else.
You guys can't see me because I'm using Mike's speaker. But so our urban agriculture program is for urban and small farms within certain counties in Indiana. So parts of Allen County, Adams County, DeKalb, Steuben, Wells, and then very small parts of Noble are eligible for this program. So that's small farms, urban farms, community gardens. So we offer free soil testing for people in that category, as well as different types of technical assistance. So if you have a question, we're more than happy to come to do a site visit and assess different erosion or any other questions. If we don't know the answer, we'll get the answer for you. We have a lot of people like Terrie and Megan who know a lot more than maybe we do. So that's available. And then this webinar series, Coffee and Series, is through the urban program. And so that's provided through the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They have been awesome in giving us this contribution agreement to provide education like this. And so that's part of the urban program.
Yeah, and I think that this is a good time to give my normal plug on nutrients. We've discussed nutrients, somewhat more nitrogen, but we have phosphorus issues going to Lake Erie. You've all heard about the city of Toledo, when they had their drinking water shut down because of high phosphorus level. Well, actually, it's because of the microcystis caused from the algal bloom from phosphorus. So anything we can do to help keep our nutrients on the soil is going to benefit Lake Erie, the water. The algal bloom is driven by phosphorus. It's made worse and toxic by excess nitrogen in the water. So I know we have a lot of, not too many farmers on this morning, not too many egg producers, but we have a lot of home gardeners. Home yards get fertilizer, the golf courses get fertilizer put on them. So let's put on what's recommended and not over it, and let's know what you're putting on and how much. So we can all help clean Lake Erie. So any other questions, any other comments? This has been a great day.
I didn't think we would talk for almost 2 hours. This is great.
I didn't have to do anything. You're a dream team.
Someone asked if the recording will be available for later.
Yes, the recording will be available on, you'll be able to find it on YouTube, right? The link will be on our website where we can find these things. We can find all of them we've done. We started this last winter, more egg producers on cover crops and interseeding, and we've done soil testing. We've done a whole host of things. Probably a good time to say what's coming up. Next month, on June 15th, from 8:30 to 10:30 again, is Coffee and Farmers Market. Lee Rowan from the Fort Wayne Farmers Market is going to be on here, and someone else yet to be decided, to be announced by Joelle. She's holding that a secret for us. So it's going to fit right in. The urban gardening is a great thing to be in. I love eating the vegetables out of the garden. You guys talking about composting, and on my farm, I raise chickens and eggs on the pasture, and so my composting is run through the chickens, and I get to eat them as eggs or meat. So great.
Yeah, they're much tastier than worms or soldier fly.
I like the comment that somebody had there. Somebody must not like worms because they didn't want to do vermicomposting. But worms are my best friend on the farm.
They are.
There's nothing better than that.
Great. Well, thank you for everyone. Thank you for the invite from Soil and Water Conservation District. If anybody has any questions, hit me up on email. But if it's about composting, just send them all to Megan.
And I do want to thank Mark one more time. So he joined, he has a wealth of knowledge. If you have questions, reach out to me, reach out to Mark, reach out to me, and I can reach out to Mark. Whatever you have questions on, we will be able to answer them on composting, I swear.
And again, the Soil and Water Conservation District is always here we don't know a lot of things, but we can certainly find out and pass them on to the people that do.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
Happy Tuesday. Bye.
All right, go get composting. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.